Carlson merely wants to thank his listeners for the good ratings. He's a very grateful guy.
Be grateful to me. Give me some money.
Well, these things take time.
Spoken like a true crypto-fascist puppet of the managerial elite.
Picture this. A radio station so far down the ratings that it couldn't compete with static. A bumbling general manager whose biggest triumph was surviving his own promotions. A morning DJ who looked like he'd been awake for 3 consecutive decades. And somehow, all of this added up to one of the most beloved sitcoms ever to grace American television. That was WKRP in Cincinnati, 4 seasons, 90 episodes, and a legacy that has absolutely refused to quit since CBS pulled the plug in 1982. The show was sharp, weird, genuinely funny, and ahead of its time in ways that even the people who made it didn't fully appreciate until years later. Today, we're going back to Cincinnati, back to the Plaid, the bad ratings, the worst promotions, and the best ensemble cast CBS almost accidentally assembled for 15 weird facts you didn't know about WKRP in Cincinnati. Before we dive in, hit like and subscribe if you love deep dives into the TV that shaped us. And now, let's get to it. Starting with number 15. WKRP in Cincinnati didn't begin as a high-concept pitch or a studio mandate. It began as Hugh Wilson trying to process what he'd witnessed during his time working at WQXI, an Atlanta-based top 40 AM station in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Wilson had gone into advertising after college, and WQXI, known locally as Quixie in Dixie, was one of his clients. Spending time around that station gave him a front-row seat to the organized chaos of commercial radio, the ego-driven DJs, the oblivious management, the sales reps who could talk the chrome off a bumper but couldn't balance a ledger, the dedicated support staff who kept the whole operation from flying apart at the seams. When Wilson eventually transitioned into television writing and producing, he brought all of that with him. The characters in WKRP weren't invented. They were remembered, and that distinction matters enormously to why the show still feels alive decades later. You can write a funny character. You can't fabricate authenticity. Wilson had soaked up enough real radio absurdity that WKRP practically wrote itself, and the people who'd actually worked in radio recognized their own lives on screen immediately. The series premiered on CBS on September 18, 1978, and for everyone who'd ever sat behind a microphone or sold ad time or answered phones at a struggling station, it was like watching a documentary with a laugh track. One of the things that makes the WKRP ensemble so singular is how little of it was inevitable. The cast didn't arrive as a package. They came from entirely different places, backgrounds, and career trajectories, and the chemistry that resulted was both accidental and irreplaceable. Gary Sandy, who played program director Andy Travis, had done stage work and some television but wasn't a household name when he was cast. Gordon Jump, who played station manager Arthur Big Guy Carlson, came from a background in commercial acting. Howard Hesseman had been part of the San Francisco improvisational comedy scene, specifically the legendary Committee, and had actually worked as a real DJ in that city under the name Don Sturdy. Tim Reed had been doing stand-up comedy and acting before landing the role of Venus Flytrap. Lonnie Anderson was a relatively unknown actress from Minnesota. Jan Smithers had appeared on Welcome Back, Kotter. Richard Sanders and Frank Bonner both came from extensive character actor work. What united them was a sensibility, a willingness to play grounded, specific, real human beings rather than sitcom archetypes. Hugh Wilson, directing the pilot himself, recognized it immediately. These weren't people playing at being a radio station crew. They became one. That's why audiences believed in WKRP in a way that went beyond simple entertainment. Here's a piece of WKRP history that surprises almost everyone who hears it. Howard Hesseman wasn't originally going to play Dr. Johnny Fever. When producers first approached him about the show, the role they had in mind for him was Herb Tarlek, the plaid-coated, perpetually overpromising sales manager, played ultimately by Frank Bonner. Hesseman passed. Not impolitely, but firmly. He'd read the scripts, understood the world Wilson was building, and he knew which frequency he was supposed to be broadcasting on. Johnny Fever, the burned-out, cynical, darkly funny morning DJ, was his character. He simply knew it. The role of Johnny Fever had been partly inspired by a real Atlanta radio personality named Skinny Bobby Harper, whose frenetic, unpredictable on-air presence was well known throughout the Southeast. Hessman's own history as DJ Don Sturdy gave him a foundation to build on, but he brought something else to the character, a philosophical weariness, a man who'd seen enough of the world to be appropriately disgusted by most of it, but still showed up every day to play great records for people he'd never meet. Once Hesseman started improvising his on-air breaks during production, nobody questioned his decision. The character's deadpan delivery, his reflexive contempt for authority, his bizarre but oddly touching moral code, all of it came from Hessman's deep understanding of who Johnny Fever was and why he mattered. WKRP in Cincinnati was set in Cincinnati for a reason that had nothing to do with Cincinnati. Hugh Wilson, who'd never actually been to the city, simply liked how the name sounded. He needed a recognizable American city that wasn't New York or Los Angeles, somewhere Midwestern and specific, and Cincinnati hit the right phonetic note. WKRP in Atlanta, his actual inspiration, didn't have the same rhythm, so Cincinnati it was. The fictional call letters WKRP were chosen because they were genuinely available. The FCC hadn't assigned them to any actual station. But Cincinnati's real AM powerhouse, WKRC, found the similarity irresistible. Rather than issuing cease and desist letters or grumbling about brand confusion, WKRC leaned into the association entirely. The station tweaked its own promotional jingles to play on the connection, essentially absorbing free publicity from a hit television show while audiences cheerfully mixed the two up. It was an early example of a media property finding an organic way to benefit from a cultural moment, and it cost them exactly nothing. Whether confused listeners tuned into WRC, hoping to hear Dr. Johnny Fever and Venus Flytrap, is not recorded in the historical documents, but the possibility is delightful. Bailey Quarters, the quietly competent, intellectually sharp assistant program director played by Jan Smithers, became one of the most beloved characters on the show. She was the anti-stereotype, the woman in the background who was demonstrably the most capable person in every room she occupied, whose intelligence was never played for laughs and never required anyone else's validation. What's remarkable is how close the show came to never developing her that way at all. In the earliest conceptual stages of WKRP, the female staff were more broadly drawn. It was through the casting of Smithers, whose subtle, internally rich performance communicated entire paragraphs through a single glance, that the writers began writing toward what Bailey could actually be. Hugh Wilson has said in interviews that Smithers' own qualities, her observational intelligence and quiet precision, shaped how the character was written after the pilot. The show explicitly modeled Bailey after Wilson's own wife, specifically that quality of being the smartest person in a conversation while being entirely unbothered about whether anyone else noticed. On a television landscape where women in sitcoms were too often defined by their relationships to men, Bailey Quarters was an outlier, defined instead by her competence, her professional dedication, and her absolute refusal to be underestimated, even when no one was paying enough attention to underestimate her. Every WKRP conversation eventually arrives here. Turkey's Away, the Thanksgiving episode from Season 1, in which station manager Arthur Carlson organizes a holiday promotion that involves dropping live turkeys from a helicopter onto a shopping mall parking lot, is not only the most famous episode of the series, it ranks consistently on lists of the greatest single episodes in American sitcom history. The final line, Gordon jumps Arthur Carlson, shell-shocked and searching for words, arriving at, "As God is my witness, I thought turkeys could fly," has been quoted so often and for so long that it's effectively entered the English language as its own idiom. What many viewers don't know is that the episode had a real-world antecedent. The production team was aware of at least one actual radio promotion from the 1960s in which a Dallas station distributed turkeys to the public, not from a helicopter, and not with the catastrophic airborne results depicted on screen, but with enough promotional chaos in a parking lot setting that the echoes are clear. Wilson and the writers took that kernel of genuine radio world absurdity and followed it to its logical extreme. What if someone actually tried to do this from the air? The genius of the episode isn't the slapstick, though Richard Sanders' Les Nessman, delivering a live radio report in the style of the Hindenburg coverage, is one of the most sustained pieces of comedic performance in TV history. The genius is Arthur Carlson's unshakable conviction. He wasn't negligent or reckless. He was genuinely, completely, cosmically certain that this would work. That confidence in the face of total ignorance is the engine that makes the joke eternal. Here is one of the more quietly extraordinary production details in television history. The WKRP set, the gloriously cluttered, sticker-plastered, chaotic broadcast booth and bullpen that looked more lived in than most people's actual offices, wasn't designed by a Hollywood art department with a budget and a mood board. It was built by the radio community itself. The show's creators put out a request in industry trade publications, including Billboard magazine and Radio and Records, asking working radio stations across the United States and Canada to send in their bumper stickers, promotional materials, decals, and any other identifying swag they could part with. The industry responded with remarkable generosity. Boxes arrived from stations in every major market, stuffed with everything that stations use to mark their identity. Call letter stickers, format logos, event promotions, contest graphics. The set designers used all of it. Every surface in the WKRP studio that could hold a sticker got one. The result was a broadcast environment that was instantly, unmistakably real, because it was made of real things, real artifacts from real stations, representing the actual visual language of American commercial radio in the late 1970s. For people who worked in radio, watching the show became a sport, spotting your own station's sticker somewhere in the background of a scene. It was a nationwide Easter egg hunt conducted over 4 seasons, and it turned every radio professional in North America into a stakeholder in the show's authenticity. Les Nessman, Richard Sanders' perpetually wound-up, deeply earnest, somewhat fragile news director, is one of the great comedic creations in television history. His devotion to journalistic integrity at a station that treats news as an afterthought, his imaginary office walls. He would carefully mime knocking and entering through doors that didn't physically exist, his unshakable dignity in the face of constant institutional disrespect. All of it is brilliant characterization. But one of his most enduring traits, the fact that Les was almost always sporting some kind of bandage or visible injury, came about entirely by accident. When Richard Sanders arrived to film the pilot, he had a genuine injury. He was actually bandaged from a real incident. The production was moving fast. Pilots don't have the luxury of waiting for anyone's bruises to heal, so the bandage stayed. Rather than try to write around it or minimize it, Sanders pitched something more interesting. What if Les Nessman was simply always, mysteriously, chronically injured? What if the show never explained it, never drew attention to it, just let the bandages accumulate as a running background gag? The writers loved it immediately, and the explanation, when Les was occasionally pressed on it, was invariably the same. His large, ill-tempered dog. Just the dog. No further details. This inexhaustible, unnamed, apparently savage dog became one of the show's most beloved recurring absences. A character who never appeared, and yet whose presence was felt in every taped knuckle and wrapped forearm throughout the series. WKRP in Cincinnati had one of the most chaotic broadcast schedules in network television history, and that is a category with considerable competition. Over the course of its 4-season run, CBS placed the show in 12 different time slots. Not different nights over different seasons. 12 distinct slots, including multiple moves within single seasons. The show premiered in September 1978 on Monday nights at 8 p.m., a slot that placed it directly against NBC's Little House on the Prairie, at the time one of the most watched programs on television. And Welcome Back, Kotter. After 8 episodes, CBS pulled it from the schedule entirely, which would normally suggest a cancellation. Instead, something unusual happened. Critics wouldn't stop writing about it. Radio professionals sent fan letters to the network, the cast, and Hugh Wilson himself, saying the show had captured their working lives with uncanny accuracy. CBS brought it back and eventually gave it a post-Dallas time slot, one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in 1970s network television. And the show responded by finishing season 2 at number 22 in the Nielsen ratings. A legitimate, unambiguous hit. So CBS moved it, because they wanted that slot for other programming. The show wandered through the schedule for its remaining 2 seasons, Saturdays, Wednesdays, early, late, paired with shows that had nothing in common with it, and audiences who couldn't track it stopped finding it. The ratings eroded not because WKRP stopped being good, but because consistent viewership in the pre-DVR era required consistency of broadcast, and CBS couldn't provide it. The final insult: after canceling the show in 1982, CBS then aired the remaining unaired episodes in a consistent summer slot. The very thing the show had needed for years arrived precisely when it could no longer do any good. One of the qualities that made WKRP feel genuinely different from other workplace sitcoms of its era was the music. Creator Hugh Wilson insisted that the show use real tracks, actual hits from real artists who would plausibly be heard on a rock radio station in 1978. The Rolling Stones, Blondie, Ted Nugent, The Who, not soundalikes, not royalty-free approximations, but the actual recordings. To make this economically possible, the production exploited a licensing loophole specific to the period. Music synchronization fees were substantially cheaper for programs shot on videotape than for programs shot on film. Most sitcoms of the era shot on film. WKRP, deliberately and specifically, shot on videotape, more like a variety show than a traditional sitcom, in order to access those lower rates. It was a creative production decision driven by a licensing technicality, and it gave the show its sonic identity. The problem arrived when the original licensing agreements expired and the show moved into syndication, negotiating new licenses for every piece of music in 90 episodes of television, with artists whose market value had changed substantially since the original deals, proved economically impossible. Scenes that had originally been scored with recognizable rock music were replaced with generic production tracks that destroyed the atmosphere entirely. Worse, because the dialogue and music had been recorded together on the same tape tracks, some of the replacements required new dialogue to be dubbed in by voice impersonators, leading to scenes where familiar characters appeared to speak with unfamiliar voices, or where lips moved in ways that didn't match what was being heard. Hugh Wilson said publicly that he couldn't watch the syndicated versions. They had lost something fundamental. In 2014, Shout! Factory released a complete series DVD set that restored approximately 85% of the original music, negotiating individually with artists and rights holders. Some tracks still couldn't be cleared at any price, but for most fans, it was the closest the show had sounded to itself in over 3 decades. On December 3, 1979, 11 people were killed in a crowd crush outside Riverfront Coliseum in Cincinnati before a concert by The Who. The tragedy exposed critical failures in venue crowd management, communication between law enforcement and event organizers, and the use of festival seating, general admission floor arrangements that incentivized early, aggressive entry. WKRP in Cincinnati was, at the time of the disaster, literally set in Cincinnati. The production team faced a choice about whether and how to address an event that had killed 11 people in the city their fictional station called home. They chose to address it directly. The resulting episode, which aired in 1980 while the city was still processing the grief and the investigations, did not soften its treatment of the tragedy. The WKRP staff confronted their own roles in shaping public perception of rock music and concert culture, grappled with the inadequacy of the station's response in the immediate aftermath, and engaged with questions of responsibility and communication that had no clean resolutions. The laugh track was largely absent. The episode ended without a redemptive conclusion. It just ended, the way real tragedies end, with grief that doesn't resolve by the time the credits roll. Years later, the episode found a second life as a teaching tool. It became standard viewing in journalism programs, broadcasting curricula, and emergency management courses as an example of how media institutions respond, and fail to respond, to breaking tragedy. Cincinnati officials reportedly referred to it during subsequent reviews of crowd safety policies. A sitcom episode became part of the civic record. That's an unusual legacy by any measure. Jennifer Marlowe was, in the original conception of WKRP in Cincinnati, a supporting character in the most literal sense, present to support scenes, deliver messages, and occupy the reception desk. She had no planned story arc, no backstory, no future beyond the pilot. She was designed as functional scenery. Then Lonnie Anderson walked onto the set. What Anderson brought to Jennifer wasn't in any draft of the script. It was a quality of total self-possession, a woman who understood her own worth precisely and completely, who couldn't be rattled or diminished, who treated the daily chaos around her as mildly interesting, whether rather than a crisis. The comedy in Anderson's performance came not from Jennifer reacting to things, but from Jennifer failing to react to things, from the gap between the disaster unfolding around her and her own perfect equanimity. Hugh Wilson saw it immediately and expanded the role before the pilot had finished filming. Jennifer Marlowe became a series regular, and the writers began building episodes around her, not as comic relief, not as a romantic subplot generator, but as the show's most reliable source of intelligence and clarity. In a building full of people managing their feelings loudly and poorly, Jennifer Marlowe had already finished managing her feelings years ago and moved on to more interesting things. The subversion of the dumb blonde receptionist trope was entirely deliberate once Anderson demonstrated what the character could be. Jennifer was smarter than everyone around her. She was better compensated than most of them, and she was the only person at WKRP who consistently understood what was happening and why. The joke was never on Jennifer. The joke was always on the people who underestimated her. Tim Reed came to WKRP with a clear sense of what Venus Flytrap could be, and an equally clear sense of what the character should refuse to become. In 1978, black characters in primetime ensemble comedies were still frequently written within narrow, predictable parameters. Reed understood the professional landscape and decided, essentially, to operate outside it. Venus Flytrap, the smooth, cerebral, night shift DJ whose on-air persona was built around the quiet storm format, a blend of mellow R&B and jazz that was transforming urban radio in the late 1970s, was a character with genuine interiority. His real name was Gordon Sims. He was a Vietnam veteran from New Orleans, a former high school chemistry teacher, a man who'd made some bad choices involving a woman and a jewelry theft, and had rebuilt his life under a different identity. He meditated. He had a philosophical framework. He was curious about the world in ways that exceeded his job description. Reed pushed throughout the production for Venus to have intelligence, cultural specificity, and real depth. He brought pieces of his own worldview into the character, his interest in Taoism, his belief in introspection and deliberate living, and he insisted on having input into the music Venus actually played on air. The segments featuring Venus had an authentic quiet storm feel because Reed made sure they did, personally selecting tracks that fit the character's sensibility rather than accepting whatever was available. The result was a character that television hadn't quite seen before. Not a stereotype, not a corrective to a stereotype, which is its own kind of flattening, but simply a specific, layered, interesting human being who happened to be the best DJ at a struggling Cincinnati radio station. Decades later, fans have assembled entire fictional playlists of what Venus would have spun during his shift. The character was vivid enough to generate a discography. The opening theme of WKRP in Cincinnati, the soft rock anthem written by Tom Wells with lyrics by Hugh Wilson and performed by Atlanta musician Steve Carlisle, is deservedly celebrated. It charted nationally. It told the entire story of Andy Travis before he appeared on screen. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the finest sitcom themes in television history. But the closing theme might actually be stranger and more interesting. Atlanta musician Jim Ellis wrote the closing music. During the demo phase, a rough, scratch recording meant purely to convey the feel of the piece. Ellis hadn't written actual lyrics. Instead, he did what many composers do during demos. He simply mumbled. Placeholder sounds, syllables that felt right rhythmically, words that weren't quite words, rock and roll nonsense that gave the performance energy without committing to any actual meaning. Hugh Wilson heard the demo and made an executive decision. Keep it exactly as recorded. Don't clean it up. Don't write real lyrics. Don't change a single mumble.